We're about to start. Good morning, everybody. I'm pleased to chair the final plenary session of the Industrial Relations in Europe Conference. I am Mario Pianta from Scuola Normale Superiore, and I am very pleased to thank Guglielmo Meardi as organizer of this very interesting and intense event, and to introduce our two keynote speakers of the final session. The first one is Donatella Della Porta, our Dean, and the second one is INES Wagner. Let me just introduce them together. Donatella Della Porta is Professor of Political Science and Dean of this faculty, Director of our PhD program, and Head of the Cosmos Center on Social Movement Studies. Has received a large number of prizes and honorary PhDs in different universities, and is a major expert, as you know, on social movements and the complexity of political processes, participation, and activism. The theme of her speech will be trade unions as social movement organizations, and she will open up a bridge between the stream of research focusing on social movement and civil society activism, and the traditional line of research focusing on trade unions and the role of labor. This is in this direction she has worked recently with several books. One recent book was Social Movement in Times of Austerity. A previous book was Can Social Movement Save Democracy? But the next book will be probably titled Labor Conflicts in Digital Capitalism, where a social movement approach will be combined with the analysis of current conflicts. Some of them have been already introduced by her co-authors, Cini, Chesta, and other colleagues. So the first speech will bring this bridge with the social movement literature. The second speaker we are pleased to welcome here is Ines Wagner, senior researcher at the Institute for Social Research in Oslo, Norway. Her research is focused on labor migration and EU integration, and among her many books and articles, there is the book Workers Without Borders, Posted Work and Other Work and Precarity in the EU, Cornell University Press. She's currently leading a large international project on the international recruitment of workers in the shipbuilding industry, and the case of the shipbuilding industry will be at the core of her presentation in a while. Unmaking European labor markets, the case of shipbuilding. Shipbuilding, as you know, is a very important case where we have the combination of highly fragmented labor processes plus high-tech and high innovation dynamics, a highly global system, a crucial link with the global transport and logistic networks, so is something which is at the core of a variety of the themes that have been discussed in some of our sessions before. So I am pleased to give Donatella the floor, and we will be hearing your presentation. Final point. We are glad to have a large, hopefully large, online audience, and we will take some few questions of clarification after each of the two presentations, but then we have time for an open discussion in the end. Our colleagues who are online are invited to use the YouTube comment facility, and they will keep an eye on them, and summarizing for the physical audience here their questions and demands in our discussion. Donatella, please.
Thank you, Mario, very much, and especially Thank you, Guglielmo, and thank you to the Industrial Relations in Europe conference to let us reopen the Altana to the public after so many months of reduced access. And as Mario said, I am an expert on social movements, not on industrial relations, and this means that I'm going to see especially the ways in which some industrial conflicts, some labor conflicts, can be addressed through the lenses of social movements. I'm not pretending that all industrial relations is to be bridged with social movement studies, but I'm building upon a new trend in social movement studies that I think is interesting also for industrial relations and for a new trend that I've seen developing in industrial relations. And in this sense, it is not by chance, I think, that social movement studies and labor studies in particular are developing more connections now than they had in the past. And for me, one of the personal connections that I have developed has been through working with a sociologist that had an important influence in the study of labor movement, labor conflicts, which is Alessandro Pizzorno. And so, as you are going to see, I'm also using a lot his work because I considered it as building upon both type of perspective and helping us also to understand nowadays conflicts, which is what I want to look at. I've talked, I think, in this room as well about this bridge between labor studies and social movement studies. But I think that I can be a bit innovative because since the last time I talked about this, what I realized is that the traditional discontent with the fact that the two fields are not talking to each other is actually reduced. So in the work that we have been doing with Lorenzo and Riccardo as well, we started to find a lot of parallel and potential bridging between the two disciplines. So I want to develop in the talk two perspectives. First of all, saying why the research on labor movements was bracketed out or at least for a period suspended in social movement studies. But then I also want to say more in a more positive mood how I think that nowadays not only there is a need, but there is actually also a beginning or maybe also something going beyond the beginning. See if I cannot. Oh, Francesco, if I use this one. Ah, yes. So, usually the traditional way of opening books and reflections from the social movement perspective about labor has been little connection. So also in the book that Mario mentioned, whose subtitle was Bringing Class Back, Capitalism Back in Social Movement Studies, the rhetorical departure was to say little interactions between the two fields. And traditionally, the observations was that in social movement studies, class cleavage has been considered as pacified. And as Beverly Silver and others have noted, the mainstream on social movement literature has in large measure dismissed the concept of capitalism from its toolkit for understanding social movements. But it's interesting what Beverly Silver said. She said, it's not just the social movement literature, but it is also research on industrial relations that for a long time have given up their reflection on capitalism. Also, there was an explanation about why there was little attention to the social dynamic and the social movement side of social movements, of labor movements. Here, for instance, Rick Fantasi and Stefan Norris, that are among the few scholars in social movement studies focused on the labor movement, observed that what made also difficult for social movement studies to study unions was that, indeed, for a long time, unions did not function as social movements. So traditionally in social movement studies, a lot of research moved beyond the research on labor, starting often with singling out the many reasons for the weakening of the unions. Traditionally, from Alberto Melucci to Alain Touraine, the observations was an observations which was shared also in labor movement studies of the weakening of the unions as related with processes of deindustrialization, but also the observations of the ways in which economic structural transformations had weakened labor, also from the point of view of the type of social relations, the type of common dispositions, and therefore also collective action. So how not only structural transformations, but the lack of hegemony of labor was related, in some cases it was said, to its own success in introducing a welfare state and so on. And so social movement studies has developed a lot on these ideas that the labor conflicts was pacified, the cleavage in Rocanian terms between labor and capital was channeled into institutional forms, and that structural and technological changes as well had been breaking down the sort of resources that usually the labor movements had used in the past. So labor was still there, but it was less important for social movements and social movement studies. And this type of reflections was also connected with reflections on classes, in the observations especially of precarizations of labor that had also weakened the traditional resources. So there were two narratives that developed in social movement studies. One was labor is no longer important as a conflictual actors because they won. And the other narrative was labor is no longer important because they have lost the battles. And probably this also chronologically corresponded to the two different periods, with more and more attention paid to the weakening of the presence of the unions. This is sort of the past, and one of the reasons why social movement studies had focused on conceptions of conflict, but new conflict, and this idea of new conflict, new social movements, and so on, it developed in a sort of, say, alternative sort of zero-sum game between the presence of new movements and the presence of old movements. When I wrote this book on social movements in austerity, and with this attempt to bring capitalism, classes, and so on back into social movement studies, this reacted also to the perceptions that that story of institutionalizations was partial. And in this, a point of reference was a scholar of industrial relations, especially of labor conflict, like Beverly Silver, That was working also with concepts of social movements in the idea of the world system approach and the anti-systemic movement of Wallerstein. But was also focusing attention on one of her main books was The Forces of Labor. And what she, and then also other scholars that were able to talk to both disciplines observed was that the idea of the institutionalizations was reflecting a specific time, but also specific regional characteristics. So it was the Trente Glorieuses, but it was also the north of the world. While what she suggested was that the labor movements is always re-emerging, so that each attempt to expand capitalism is reflected in a development of new type of conflicts. So she wrote, notwithstanding its popularity in the literature, the thesis that capital mobility produces a straightforward race to the bottom is suspect on theoretical and empirical grounds. And according to her and her work, especially on the south of the globe, rather the historical pattern is one in which capital does indeed relocate geographically in search of cheaper and more docile labor, but ends up creating new working classes. And in fact, her main slogan was the slogan of where capital goes, conflicts follows. And the attention there was also in China on new areas, and also the development after labor moves also in these new regions. So the idea was that the visions of the decline of labor was partial in time and in space. So revival also means it is possible and necessary to return to a dialogue between social movement studies and labor studies. And some reflections we have been doing also with Riccardo and Lorenzo in these directions is where can we look at in order to find ways to address some main questions that are relevant for both types of literature. One is the structural question, so how capitalism develops, how the society develops, because I think that this is the main contributions of social movement studies, the attention not only to what is going on in the industries or in the place where people work, but also outside. Second question is the organizational dimensions, and third question is the action. Sometimes jokingly, I refer to the first one as the more Marxist type of approach, the second the Leninist, and the third the Luxemburgian. But I think that indeed there have been, beyond the political attention, also in both disciplines, attention to address these questions in forms that may have been partial, but that are developing towards bringing in the potential for more interactions. And I want to briefly go into these three type of questions and potential answers. So, contextual changes. Approaching the literature on labor and industrial relations, especially the one reflecting on the characteristics of capitalism, I think we can, as social movement scholars, found a very rich references to various types of transformations, because in this book I was looking at the reflections of neoliberal capitalism, But I think that's also the concepts we have been working with, digital capitalism, or the Mike Savage concept of shareholder capitalism, or concepts of predatory capitalism, are all important to keep in mind conjunctively, because they tell us a lot about the labor movements and the differences that we are observing, that I think Riccardo and Lorenzo have already mentioned, between different groups of workers, according to the different mix of the ways in which these conceptualizations apply to specific circumstances. So this is all important, I think, for labor study and industrial relations reflections. What can come from social movement studies is the attentions to the importance of general conflicts in the society. So the fact that even in the traditional approach to labor, the type of analysis never focused only on the labor places, but they went well beyond the labor, looking at the impact in the societies. Turen, Melucci, and others have been important scholars that came from the observations of the labor movement, but then developed the so-called new social movement approach, looking at the ways in which other conflicts are developed. I think they can be criticized, and they have been criticized also on the basis of Beverly Silver observations, among others, that they focus on a specific moment and place. But I think that the important element that we can revisit there is the fact that they've considered class conflict or deep divisions in societies as still very relevant to explain the transformation. So I think they maybe imagine the situations in which they were, the research they were making in the 70s as something that represented the final end of the evolutions of societies. This was wrong, but I think that their approach, by looking at the connections between these different levels, and especially thinking about conflicts as societal conflicts, can be revisited. Another questions that is quite relevant in both disciplines is the questions of organization. So labor studies have been criticized also from the inside, especially in new type of approaches to labor and industrial relations, for their focus on labor unions as main organizational channels. So recent research at CENI and others have suggested that the unions are important, but that many conflicts can be important that emerge in a more spontaneous way. And that's especially when we look at conflicts in the south of the globe, in conditions in which unions are not recognized, but also in sectors and areas in which the unions are not institutionalized actors. Often the conflicts develop otherwise. And so organizations is still important, but there are conflicts in which it is not the labor unions that triggers the conflict, that accompany the conflict, but others. And I think that here social movement studies can contribute with attention to what has been defined as social movement unionism, so a concept that has developed, pointing especially at the role that unionism developed beyond the factories, the ways in which unions participated in other conflicts, among which the democratization conflicts, South Africa, India, cases in which, but also Latin American cases in which the social movement unionism conception has been developed. But also I think there is a point in social movement studies that could be fruitful to reflect upon also in labor studies, and it is the idea of organizing beyond the idea of organization. So considering conflicts not as spontaneous because the unions are not there, but reflections on power resources that are no longer the same for the union, the same they were in the past, or for the labor, not the ones that were in the past, but which are still important. And here I was often thinking about a famous article by scholars that also tried to bridge the two disciplines long ago. Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward. And what they observed already a couple of decades ago about especially the United States was a sort of return to forms of conflicts of the past in which the resources for the unions and labor came from the community rather than from the industrial relations themselves. And so this also dovetails with the empirical observations about the development of conflicts in new areas in which also the community is important. Think about, for instance, the conflicts on unemployment in Argentina or other type of conflicts that are much more community conflicts but remain also labor conflicts and conflicts related to this. So the idea of social movement unions, but also other concept that developed is that the organizations is more coalitional and horizontal, so that what is important is the connections between different groups, that the frames is broad, class beyond class identities, and that in terms of actions, protest in the street, as we have been seeing also in recent conflicts, is a sort of way to re-territorialize a relationship that has been more and more de-territorialized. And so I think that social movement studies can offer instruments to look at coalitions that are quite important, also quite important in sort of updating some influential work that has been done in industrial relations by Kelly and the other scholars that tried to import in industrial relations the concepts of resource mobilization that has developed in social movement studies. But I agree with the critique and assessment that have been done also by labor scholars that Kelly have introduced an important frame, but that probably this needs to be updated also with reference to what is developing in social movement studies as observations on what is going on beyond the labor, beyond the frame of injustice that was so relevant for Kelly, and beyond the leadership role that was also considered important. So the same type of development that we observed in the research on social movement studies, in which resource mobilization approaches were considered as too instrumental, I think develop also could be useful also in reflecting on industrial point. I want to devote this, I think, last 10 minutes, 5 minutes, to the final point that I want to make, but that I think is the main contributions that social movements can give to the analysis of industrial conflict, and which is related with the idea of resources emerging from the conflict themselves. So William Sewell talked of eventful temporalities as events that can break the constraints of structures and can transform resources and opportunities for movement. So moment of turning points in which events like campaigns can produce big transformations. And in social movement studies, we have the concept of eventful protest to single out this capacity of protest to create networks, to create ideas and frames and identities, and in one word, solidarity, that has been one of the main concepts that they developed. So not all protests, not all strikes are eventful, but there are moments in which we perceived, like in different types of elections or other political moments, that structures can be challenged. And here, I think that Pizzorno's work can be influential and relevant once again in singling out or in suggesting when this type of moment of eventful protest could be relevant in research on social movements in general, but also on labor conflicts in particular. And Pizzorno singled out two types of conflicts in looking at especially the industrial relations, the labor conflicts. One conflict that's, can I say, ideally or necessarily better, comes before, and it is the conflict of recognitions, when new identities have to develop. And he was working with Colin Crouch, Hyman, other colleagues, David Soskich and others, on what they call the revival of class conflict in the late 60s and beginning of the 70s. And what they saw in these conflicts was the emergence of new forms of conflicts, new solidarities, other type of workers' organizations as well. So what he suggested is that when groups of workers do not feel represented by the unions or do not have unions to represent them, a first step of the conflict is oriented to the creation of an identity, or what maybe more pragmatically social movement studies through the work of Rick Fantasia have called solidarity, emergence of labor solidarity. Not only in the structural, in the recognitions of the structural exploitations, but also in action. So during the occupation, during the long grave, the long strike in the past, or more recently, occupations of factories and so on, which you have seen also examples nearby. And the idea of this research is that this moment of search for recognitions that are necessary before you can negotiate an identity have an impact on the forms of actions, on the organizational structures, and on the framing. That observations of the conflicts in the 60s and the 70s linked also to the emergence of a new working class, of workers that have experience of conflicts, but of conflicts of a different type. And so what Dubois called workers without long long-standing social adaptations to industry that bring in, like the workers coming from the south in the northern Italy, other tradition of other idea of conflicts and other forms of conflicts. As Pizzorno said, this brings about organizational adaptations, and we saw this in the past, for instance, in the emergence of much more horizontal forms of organizing, and organizing more related to the factories, to the factory level. Also, Pizzorno said this type of conflicts are different from the conflicts that negotiate already existing identities, because they tend to present non-negotiable aim, because in order to negotiate, you have to have long-term identities with which you recognize. And also what he expected was more innovative forms of actions, innovative claims, but also innovative forms. So, last words. I suspected, but I'm not sure, that in this type of work for Pizzorno, also some ideas of Rosa Luxemburg in her analysis of the general strikes in Russia are important. That is the idea that solidarity is built during actions, that the actions transforms, changes in times, that it is not using resources, but it is creating sort of new resources. So what she says is also each wave of struggles present or leave mental sediment, the ideas that it is possible to sort of empowerment, let's say. And final slide, I think this also brings back an observations by Beverly Silver, by in this case, in this framing, Alessandro Pizzorno, that stressed the fact that he wrote, it is high time that attention be paid to periodic variations in certain phenomena. Otherwise, at every new upstart of a wave of conflict, we shall be induced to think that we are at the verge of a revolution, and when the downswing appears, we shall predict the end of class conflict. So my impression is that now we are at the verge, or maybe within a new wave of labor conflicts with some transformations, and I look forward to discuss this after the other presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Donatella. I think it's very topical that you raise these points, also because this conference opened up with the case of the GKN company in Florence, and where we had in the opening session the combined voices of a more institutional trade union activism addressing the conflict, but also a more social movement-oriented activism by the shop floor workers and their initiatives. And tomorrow morning we are having in Florence a demonstration where we will see how tomorrow afternoon there will be a physical visibility of the ability of social movement unionism to take, do you want to move there? To raise these issues. Are there specific questions or clarification on Donatella's talk? Okay.
There is a question from Richard Hyman, which he managed to send through pigeons flying in. He asks, the point I would like to stress, which I think is consistent with Donatella's fascinating presentation, is that there is no such construct as social movement unionism. All unions are to some extent social movements, none are exclusively such. The issue is therefore the contradictory relationship between different elements in union identity and practice. So whether it is more a matter of principles or of types, I think.
Yes.
Can I add a little bit on this? A key question that you may integrate in your story is who is the enemy? Because, of course, in the labor struggles, the enemy is mainly the company where there is the shop floor struggle, but as new social movements address labor issues, there is a combination between political decision makers and business decision makers. So how do you see this combination of different terrains of struggle?
Yes. Thank you, first of all, Richard. I've learned a lot from your work, so I'm glad we agree. From your work, I've also read that typologization of type of labor structures and type of unions is also important. Militant unionism, different from more mainstream type of unionism. I think I agree that can say forgetting about the social movement dimensions of union was more an analytic failure than a lack of social movement dimensions also in other unions. But I think that the work by Pizzorno is also interesting in trying to understand under which conditions different forms of unionism develop. And here I can combine the answer with the answer to Mario's questions, because what we notice in the empirical research with Lorenzo and Riccardo is that of course, the specific conditions of labor are very influential in the forms that specific worker struggles take. For instance, even within the sort of hardcore digital capitalism, you have very different conditions between drivers and riders, for instance, in the logistics, which is related with the conditions of work, the sharing of spaces, and so on. And that this, but also not only those type of conditions, but also the characteristic of the workers. Because when we talk about precarious workers, we talk about workers endowed with very different type of resources. We have intellectual, so if we think in Bourdieusian terms, which is, I think, not by chance the type of development, recent development in reflections on classes that I found necessary. We still have different type of capital. So we have still capital related to the position in the labor structure, but we have social capital, we have cultural capital. And so this also introduces some differences between the type of precarious workers and sometimes within the same type of work. So if we look at the riders, what we see is that we have a component which is more less dependent on that work, that has more resources of a different type. And we have the migrants that are in a total different condition. So I think that it is also important to consider the differences. Also, what I realize as an outsider to the debate about capitalism is that these proliferations of concepts beyond the general umbrella of neoliberalism also reflect specific conditions that are more or less relevant in different areas, and transformations that can happen also very quickly. We were talking with Guglielmo about GKN and how share capitalism changed the influence in the conflict. So I think that these interactions with industrial relations experts is also important in order to single out the differences among different conflicts and the causes for them.
Thank you again, Donatella, for this opening of the complexity of the integration between trade union work and social movement analysis. So we will have space for a more general discussion at the end. And now we move to Ines Wagner with her work on unmaking European labor markets, the case of shipbuilding. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks to Guillermo and the organizers for organizing this event. I'm very happy to be here physically. I was not sure I'm going to make it, but yeah, when I was on the plane, I was very much looking forward to it and very much enjoyed the discussions so far and the discussions that still to be had, obviously. I want to start with a short anecdote before outlining what I'm going to do in the presentation. Now, in the spring of 2020, the Norwegian government made available a large crisis package to the Norwegian shipbuilding industry. And the aim of this package was to stimulate production and work in an industry that had been severely hit by the COVID-19-induced economic crisis. And within this large-scale economic and, to a certain extent, environmental incentive, a certain amount of money was put aside for the building of a research vessel for the Norwegian Institute of Marine Research. And as a government spokesperson put it, this measure would secure jobs in the shipyards in Norway and ensure stability in this industry. And importantly, the government also stated an intent to green the industry with this measure. And I don't know where each and every krona of this large crisis package went, but we do know where the money for the research vessel went. And spoiler, it wasn't to the Norwegian industry or workers, and it also did not green the industry. So what happened is this, that the assignment was awarded not to a Norwegian yard, but to the Dutch shipyard, Holland Shipyards Group. And they made an offer. The Norwegian Institute for Marine Research defended its decision was just too cost-effective to turn down. And as for the stated intent to green the industry, the vessel is now being built with diesel engines. And the reason I want to start with this anecdote is because, on the one hand, it begs the empirical question, who benefits from these national recovery mechanisms that a lot of us are looking into at the moment? So where does the money go? Who profits? And what are the limitations? But also theoretically, it shows that the market making and market correcting measures are not always binary, but are often fragmented and overlap within and between countries within a pan-European labor market. So, for example, if you take the crisis package, the idea of such a funding scheme implies the acknowledgement, but also the upholding of financially prudent and morally justifiable national borders. I mean, after all, it shows a sense of responsibility for the citizens within the country and the world they live in. Then you also have the process of the Norwegian Institute for Marine Research and its decision to grant this project to an overseas party, which is indicative of a different process. Here, national borders don't exist or they do not matter, but it's the global free market that does. And then finally, you have the third party, you have this Holland Shipyards Group, which is indicative of yet another process within the EU, namely where national borders do exist, but only as to circumvent them. Because the reason the Dutch Shipyard Group was awarded this project is not because materials are cheaper or laborers work faster, but it is because the company will hire hundreds of workers from Poland on short-term contracts with a lower wage. So, in this talk, I want to dwell on these processes and on the EU shipbuilding a little bit and move from a national perspective to a sectoral or transnational perspective to examine how this specific industry that is transnationally very connected has been hit by the COVID-19 induced economic crisis, look at some state responses and sort of benefits and limitations of those, and eventually look at the impact all of this has on mobile labor within the EU. And when I say mobile labor, I mainly refer to EU citizens that work on short-term contracts, so posting or temporary agency work contracts that are very present in some of the yards within the European shipbuilding industry. So even though the latest crisis had a particular impact on the EU shipbuilding sector, it's fair to say that it is an industry that can be viewed to be in constant crisis from the 1960s onwards. And the graph here shows how the industry went from a dominating market force to one that inhabits a niche segment. And in fact, the EU industry was believed to be a sunset industry and very much in decline until the unfolding of the European product and labor market offered a different set of choices for employers within shipbuilding by way of either offshoring production abroad or by way of insourcing labor on various short-term contracts, often in combination with employing foreign labor. And in the end, this did not lead to an increase in the market share on a global scale, but it led to a particular specialization of EU shipbuilders focusing on passenger ships, on cruise ships, but also to a very integrated product and labor supply network that can be schematically exemplified by something like this. So this would be an example of an integrated nature where we have a yard or yards in Italy, Norway, and Romania that are connected through various types of ownership. There's also an overwhelming presence of foreign labor in those yards, as well as labor mobility between those yards. But we see a differentiation in the type of labor. So in Italy, we see overwhelmingly Bengali and Romanian labor, whereas in Norway, there's an overwhelming presence of Romanian and Polish labor. And in Romania, there's an overwhelming presence of Vietnamese labor, for example. It also shows differentiation in the international division of labor when it comes to production. So when you take the case of Norway and Romania, for example, the steel production is taking place in Romania with the big hulls being produced there, then shipped to Norway, and the outfitting is taking place in Norway. And it is this integrated production and labor supply network that the pandemic interrupted in some shape and form. And even though it might have been temporal, it has still been substantial and interrupted the production as well as the labor supply side. But before I want to look at that more closely, I just want to tell you why I'm looking at those countries specifically, because they're part of a research project that was mentioned in the beginning, Shipping of Labor, where we look exactly at these processes of the changes in staffing and production strategies within the European shipbuilding industry against global competition as well as European market regulation. And a lot of the project participants are here in the room, and others might join digitally. But this is why I'm sort of looking at Italy, Norway, and Romania, and why I'll mention Poland and Germany later on as well. And we will also look at the EU level more closely. Now, when you look at the COVID crisis, it has not only been a supply-side crisis, as maybe in a lot of other cases. It's been a demand as well as a supply side crisis. And a lot of voices also said that if you look at the nature of EU shipbuilding, the oversupply or the lack in demand might be the real villain here if you look at the industry. But with COVID-19 hitting, again, there's been a new historical drop in orders from 70 to 80%, as well as cancellations, leading to closures of yards, as well as mergers and acquisitions. But what was new, I suppose, was this disruption in the labor supply and in production. And the obvious reasons are the closed borders for mobile workers, quarantine requirements, delays in delivery of parts, leading to blockages in the supply chain, but also hard closures due to COVID, either a lockdown or outbreaks at the yards. So sort of the crisis shows how much it impacted or interrupted these chains present in the shipbuilding industry. And we have some certain recovery mechanisms, packages, most prominent, the short-time work introduction, for example, at the national level, that essentially provide income for workers during either reduced activity or a complete downsize, shutdown. And in Norway and in Germany, those were existing measures which have been amended. But in Poland, for example, it was an entirely new introduction as part of the anti-crisis package that was introduced. So that's sort of for the employment side. When we look at the business support, the main measures were state loans in Poland, which have not been taken up at all by any shipyards because the conditions attached to those were just too unattractive. And the main mechanism really has been the deferral of payments for export credits, which are a large source of financialization for the yards. But what becomes apparent here is that all of these popular measures that are being discussed do not take the highly mobile workers into account, and also don't really give a space to the industry to recover. It gives them some breathing space, but not really a long-term adjustment mechanism. So we have some preliminary results as to how the industry itself responded to it. And in Poland, for example, we see that during the first part of the pandemic, I mean, it's also when you talk about the impact of the pandemic, it very much depends on the point in time you look at it. But during the first part of the pandemic, Poland was hit particularly hard, especially because of the integrated nature of its supply chain. So producers in Germany and Norway lost orders, so they lost contracts due to their supplying nature. And there, the ability to shift the production from shipbuilding to ship repair was really their way of survival. So a couple of months after the crisis hit, the industry was much more recovered, and there was not a big focus on the labor supply side, actually, so more the focus on the production side. But the future fear here of Polish trade unions is, for example, this discussion in Norway and in Germany, where you have the ask of the trade unions that public tenders should really stay within the national production system and not go abroad anymore. So even though in Poland the industry was comparatively not hit as hard or recovered maybe more quickly because of this ability to shift production, there's this fear that maybe once COVID will go away, the structure and nature of the production will change as well. In Norway, on the other hand, you see that the focus was very much on the labor supply side. So because it was the main disruption for the industry stemmed from the reliance on foreign labor, which was all of a sudden not accessible anymore. And there was a main effort by trade unions and employer associations to get exemptions on these restrictions in labor mobility for the shipbuilding industry. And even though this obviously led to a positive development for workers, because work was available again, it also showed the existing inequalities already present in the industry. And some groups of workers, specifically those highly mobile workers, found themselves already on the margins of the labor market, but have encountered adverse conditions and specific challenges posed by the crisis. What has also become apparent that a lot of these workers have been shown to be, or also publicly been announced, essential and irreplaceable workers, but without really receiving adequate protection. And so some issues were already in place and some were exacerbated by the crisis and possibly are new as well. I mean, first of all, so they faced the challenge in the closure of borders and then partial closure of borders, which was probably the most challenging of situations within the whole evolution of the crisis, because it meant either being stuck in the country of work or not being able to move, so the loss of job prospects, and once being stuck in the country of work, also the isolation from family or social circles. Then it also exposed the inability to access benefits or social assistance and support. So for example, the Norwegian United Federation of Trade Unions did a survey with its Polish members. And there they showed that most of them who work in the shipbuilding industry have been laid off with the onset of the crisis. And the issue of inability to access benefits or social assistance or any kind of support was also raised, because when you see that by April, only 6% of the Polish members of the Trade Union Federation in Norway had their applications for unemployment money approved, compared to 30% of the Norwegian workers at the time. The union questioned whether this indicates a difference in treatment, a discrimination against Polish workers, but in any case it raises the concern over the lack of clarity in rights when situated in a different country on a short-term contract, with all of the difficult employment conditions attached. And finally, it raises the issue of health and safety at work, as well as in the living circumstances for highly mobile workers, for themselves, for obvious reasons, but also for the societal level at large, due to the connection between freedom and movement and health concerns. Because as I said, in Norway, the trade union as well as the employers' organization lobbied intensively to open up the borders once everything was shut down. And indeed, in June of 2020, the Norwegian government decided to grant quarantine exemptions for working immigrants, which later in the year became very much a controversy, because it was shown that those lobbying parties, along with the government, ignored the National Institutes of Public Health's warning of so-called imported infections. So you had this quarantine exemption for tens of thousands of workers, and in the media it was very much described as to why Norway experienced a second wave of the coronavirus during the fall of 2020. And it was allegedly mainly spread by Polish and Lithuanian immigrants who started to arrive in Norway after borders were shut initially, but then opened for certain groups of essential workers. And the point here, I suppose, is that whilst these were also deemed as essential workers, who in other industries were shown public appreciation by way of clapping, even though we know this did not really lead to any substantial improvements in the working situation of those workers either. Here, the recognition of essential workers was rather paired with xenophobia. Which brings me to my final slide, where I started to consider whether there's any movement to a possible, more positive situation induced by COVID. And this is really speculative, but it raises the issue of enforcement and whether due to this whole health crisis there might be, or there already are, increased inspections, but whether that might be something that could stay and be an improvement for the situation. So the question is, the increased national inspections and the increased compliance awareness due to the health crisis, does that lead to, or in any case, it's worth tracking whether that results into a better enforcement effort. Then there's also a decreased number in certain countries of very short-term postings, but whether that's temporary or longer lasting is another question. And all of this, so meaning the COVID-19 crisis, happened against the background of the implementation of the revised Posted of Workers Directive, which, when the crisis hit, was lobbied to be postponed, the implementation date, but it did not happen in the end. But the question is in how far maybe the crisis overshadowed those implementation efforts or not. So these are sort of open questions that need to be looked at. Now, and I think coming back to the anecdote in the beginning, both the anecdote as well as the issue of highly mobile workers within the COVID crisis show this disconnect that exists between mobility and worker protection. In terms of the anecdote, the money that went abroad was insured to protect workers for a certain industry, for a national industry, but the mobility aspect was more profitable and disregarded the protection angle. Whereas the same happened with the mobile workers, where the opening of borders was more important than actually the protection or improving the protection of those workers in a case where it was very visible the precarious nature that those workers were in and the protection that they needed at the time as well. So there's been this acknowledgement of the essential nature of work, which has not been matched with a more protective system. And in a way, again, the crisis and the situation of workers showed the precarious nature and the unequal nature that they were in before the crisis hit, and the crisis made it more visible, but it also made more visible this disconnection and the regulatory system in the EU that encourages mobility without protection and does not give any rights to posted workers, for example, or temporary agency workers. And when we shift sort of the perspective from the national to the sectoral and transnational level, that we might see different picture emerging that shows this precarity better than only focusing on the national level. So with that, I'd like to end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ines. I call if there are questions of clarification. I just want to mention a documentary film which describes in a very beautiful way the complex combination of labor from different migrant origin in Porto Marghera, Venice. The title is Il pianeta in mare, the planet in the sea, because the the landscape of this industrial and shipbuilding center is like a planet facing the Venice lagoon. So it's a particularly impressive picture and the voices of the migrants from probably 20 different origins in that movie are very interesting. So I don't know if there is an English version. The director is Andrea Segre, a very good Italian film director now. By the way, little questions. In the post-COVID situation, it seems to me that the mess in the global logistical networks are showing a gap in the supply of transport ships. So a specific question is whether you have any indication that there may be a boom in shipbuilding construction as a follow-up to the lack of transport ship capacity at the moment. Any specific question? There was a question before on Donatella about financial capital, but you already addressed a little bit then we can bring this issue of the role of financial capital as opposed to industrial capital in labor struggles in the more general discussion. Okay, if there are no specific questions, I think we can open up the general discussion. We have a lot of interesting issues on the transformations of capitalism, the transformation of class conflicts, the transformation of the way labor is used, employed in different forms with different hierarchies, and how the conflicts that emerge in the labor sphere interact with conflicts outside working conditions, and there is a reciprocal learning and interaction between social movement dynamics and labor movement dynamics. I guess you are all tired after these 2 days of discussion, and but I think some final discussion can be useful. Well, I start with the question of politics and institutions, because in both cases we are seeing a strange interaction between decision-making by business and decision-making by states concerning the case of shipbuilding, migration, and welfare protection and services to workers, but also the role of the state in creating demand for the industry. We should not forget that in Fincantieri, for instance, is a state-owned Italian company, and that in this field, however, there is a lack of a clear industrial policy, which may include the interest of labor in as some of the within the framework of the goals of public policies. So we, in the case of Donatella, of course, we have this combination of struggles which demand, for instance, legislation protecting riders and logistics workers because of the gaps in the current legislation, or clearly the transformation, for instance, precarity created by clear legislation introduced by governments, which become the starting point of social movement and labor mobilization. So how, I think we need some also conceptual novelty in addressing this mix between the strategy of business and the strategy of political change in shaping these combined developments. So I would like to hear what you think about, because this has a clear strategic implication for movements. Should they identify governments as the key counterpart, or should how they can avoid a business that says, oh, we simply respect the law that is made by governments, and so it's not our fault. So, and how these possible alliances for political change can also be built. But so there is a policy and activist dimension, but there is also a conceptual way in which we can probably reframe the capital, labor, and political and citizen. But if there are sort of related questions on some broad themes, we can pick more. Or I can ask Donatella first and Ines later to address this point.
I think that the political issues is very central, and it is one of the issues that in social movement studies is discussed a lot under the label of political opportunities and threat. So an observation is that traditionally, in order to mobilize, you need to perceive the potential for change. But at the same time, that those parties that were traditionally allies with movements have moved away and have reduced sensibilities to this. And so also the idea developed that the recent social movements are more triggered by threat than by opportunities. And to a certain extent, also bridging this with other work that I've been doing, that to a certain extent you need to build new parties, or at least to change the parties. On the one hand, sometimes these two processes happen together because of the need for new parties that introduce a sort of electoral competition. And of course, the development of parties like Podemos, or like Syriza and so on, typical movement parties, is in part a response to the lack of capacity of the traditional party system to address this type of conflicts. And thinking about Norway and the recent elections, I think one can see also the transformations that you can have in the political system based on the perceptions that there are conflicts that are not represented, that you need at the same time some new parties, like in the Norwegian case, but also that this could change the party system, like maybe is happening in Germany at the moment, giving a sort of new push for social democracy to represent emerging conflicts. So the impression is that there is, with also COVID-19, the perceptions of discursive opportunities, at least, that can, like it happened after big crises like war, bring back also in social democracy and therefore in the relationship between labor and politics, the perceived need for regulation rather than deregulation, publicizations rather than privatizations, and so on. So I think there is already this connection. And I think that already the concepts we are working in, like neoliberalism, are not concepts that address only the economic and social side of the organizations, but also, as Colin Crouch, for instance, has argued very well, also the political side. So a main point is to see if the challenge of COVID can bring about, probably not Wolfgang Streeck end of capitalism, but reflections on how capitalism developed. And what we have been observing with these big conceptualizations, digital capitalism, financial capitalism, shareholder capitalism, and so on, is that the tendency has been for sure towards new conceptualizations of capitalism that also implies spirits of capitalism in Chapelot and Boltanski analysis. So something that goes beyond the last conceptualizations of the justifications for capitalism. And my impression is that this introduces also cleavages within the political class and also within the economic elite. In the research we are doing together on the rich, what one sees is also the development of different conceptions of relations with politics. If we look at the concepts now, the conflicts now, also GKN that you have looked at as an empirical example yesterday, I think that the tensions is really between forms of productions that tend to be so deterritorialized, detached from any ideas of reinvestments in productions and so on, that's sort of interrupt interactions with politics. So in the negotiations on the GKN, this was evident by the presence of the politicians and the absence, refusal of interactions by the owners, this strange conglomerate. So what we noted is also that one needs to go inside this definition of capitalism, looking also at the complexity within. So when the debate on digital capitalism started with the idea that you build up high-quality workers and so on, but when you look inside the type of conflicts, you see that digital capitalism is everywhere. But it takes different characteristics and so on. For me, the concept of shareholder capitalism, reading the work of Mike Savage and the Bourdieusian approach, has meant also importance of looking at the property, so at who are the owners and how this has an impact on the strategies. And so also at the rich as a complex type. Not going back to Poulantzas, but recognize some of the conflictual visions also inside. I think, last word, not to take Ines' time, what we see is also that this complexification is very visible in the struggles during the COVID time around issues of labor, because on the one hand you had, of course, the interventions of labor unions in the sectors in which they are strongest, that sometimes imply the complexifications of their strategies. So there were unions also that started to intervene as sort of voluntary associations, providing different resources, and in this interacting with different groups. But then we saw also broad differences within all the more precarious arenas. So from riders and drivers to struggles in the retail sectors, to the health systems, to the domestic workers, to the workers that Ines was talking about, agricultural workers, so the substitutions for the global change that was interrupted. We see a lot of specific paths that I think is important to investigate, bridging the two.
Thank you, Donatella. Ines, your turn.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think as you already mentioned, there is certainly a close connection between business and governments, especially when it comes to subsidies, starting from the 1960s onwards, which became more and more important, and then there was a decrease in subsidization in the 80s and sort of a shift in the industry, seeing we cannot solely rely on that, and then a shift in how the strategy operated, so in terms of then offshoring or insourcing of labor. And I think also now with the crisis, I mean, certainly the crisis packages have been there for the industry, but at the same time, I have the feeling there is a huge insecurity in the industry as well as to what one can expect or rely on. And one example is at the EU level, and so in 2013, See Europe, the employer representation at the EU level as well, together with Industry All, signed a joint statement to at least create an awareness in the first place for the conditions of workers. And now with COVID, it was the next time that they came together to write a joint lobbying statement to the EU to demand a certain crisis package for them. And one point was to have a specific industrial policy for the shipbuilding sector. But the EU immediately said, this is not something that we're going to do. It does not fit within the economic governance model that the EU is currently working on. So I think that's also why there's this ask within the countries, or where trade unions ask to anchor the public tenders within the national labor market. And we've seen that in Germany and in Norway. I mean, it remains to be seen how that develops, but I think certainly this feeling to secure the national industry first by way of forming these alliances with government, but also we've seen an increase in conglomerates, of business conglomerates. So I think there are ties to the government, but certainly a diversification in strategies as to how to survive. And those conglomerates, I think, are within the national space, but also on an European level. So a trend towards that. And another thing that you raised in the beginning, so the boom in transport ships, I'm not sure if were you referring to passenger cruise ships or, yeah, so that's just something that does not happen in the EU anymore. So that's why the EU was hit particularly hard because of this specialization in passenger ships or cruise ships, where there was no demand whatsoever, and remains to be seen whether any increased demand will take place. But that's why, again, sort of extending the graph that I showed earlier, you just see even a decreasing role of the EU within the global market, where the concentration of these freight ships, or the building of those, is happening in Asia, in Asian countries, yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Questions, comments? Guillermo, any last word? No. Renzo?
Like this? Really? Okay, really embarrassing. So I just wanted to take a point starting from both Donatella and Ingrid's presentation. And Donatella cited the fantastic work of Beverly Silver, who actually says that one see a decline in the conflict only if it takes this kind of Western perspective, and in reality, if you look like globally, global conflict is rising in the south of the world. And then I was also really kind of surprised by the data that INES presented about the shipbuilding industry, and how marginal, in a sense, both the European and the Western shipbuilding industry became in respect to the kind of oil production, the world production, which kind of triggered this kind of little provocation for a conference which is called Industrial Relation in Europe. And coming from a young scholar who spent the last 4 years of research looking at European economic governance, so a very Western European topic, but maybe we should actually start to kind of look in a much more, not only beyond national kind of containers, as already very well argued, but also beyond the container of Europe, in order to understand kind of the global trends for labor and industrial relations over the next decade. So yeah, I just thought that this was a point worth making. Thank you.
Any other comments? So we may Lorraine, Riccardo?
Yes, to me, I think another interesting issue is the connection between digitalization, financialization, and real labor conflicts, in a sense that it's just because the first case that comes to my mind is the one that I'm the most exposed to, it's Amazon. And basically, the retail part of Amazon is the one that is creating more jobs, but at the same time is one of the less fruitful for the stock value capital of stock market value of the company. So in this sense, there is a real, I would say, separation between the level of capital accumulation in terms of financialization, which is connected, of course, to the Amazon Web Services unit, which is the most important for the accumulation of data and so on. But on the other side, I think the real conflicts in the real world are the ones, of course, that are concerning workers in logistics and the one working in the fulfillment. So I think that there should be a focus really on this common connection in capitalism, which are very separated in terms of capability of intervening on these processes of accumulation. So I don't have any answer to this, but I think it's crucial also the involvement of the so-called technicians in this conflict. So there are some groups like the Data for Black Lives in the United States and so on, or the first forms of workers' collective at Alphabet in Google, which are going in this direction, but it is still unknown which kind of connection you have with the real workers in the more manual component of the labor process and these cognitive workers, knowledge workers.
Riccardo? Arianna?
Thank you very much. I guess this is more like a general reflection, not just on Donatella's and Ines's very interesting presentation, but thinking back a little bit more broadly about the last few days and the general focus of the discussions we've been having. So I was just thinking that I find it quite interesting that we are at a sort of industrial relations in Europe conference, and yet it seemed to me that in most of the panels we actually had fairly little reflections yet on, I suppose, how the European level of industrial relations and the level of European governance and politics might be evolving in the aftermath of COVID-19 as a terrain of labor struggles. And I guess it's probably because it's still quite early to say, right? Because things are changing every day in front of our eyes, and we still don't have a very clear idea of, for example, what would be, the new framework of European economic governance when things stabilize, what will really come out of Next Generation EU, and so on. But I was wondering whether perhaps our two keynote speakers might offer some sort of reflection based on their specific points of view, on how do they see the European space, and I guess the European regulatory and policy space as evolving as a field of intervention for, for example, in terms of Donatella's contribution, in terms of, labor's capacity as a social movement to act on a European scale, and in case of Ines's case study, how do you see if any potential, if there is any trajectory of potential change in terms of the EU's role in the sector, and is it a kind of progressive trajectory, or a sort of, as you were saying, not my business, deal with it at the national level, we don't want to intervene type thing. So kind of like some reflection on the European arena, I guess.
Yeah, thanks. I have a question that links with Arianna's point on the European dimension of the regulation of industrial relation. And I am wondering, listening to Ines' presentation and knowing a bit of her work on posted workers, I was wondering if, okay, this is a moving target yet, but to what extent the role of regulation of posted work is actually playing out in this specific conjuncture, economic conjuncture, in the 3 cases that you are studying also with the other researchers. In the construction sector, we are seeing now that there will be a lot of work because of the recovery plans at the national level, and this will create quite some mobility, enhanced mobility in Italy, but also in other countries. And this is not, it's not playing well for the protection of this worker at the national level, and it's not surprising, right? But I was wondering, what are you seeing in your research about that in the last months after COVID, and whether this is becoming or will become a contested terrain, if there are any actors that will be challenging the regulation of posted work and also mobility in general within the European Union. Thanks.
So if there is no one else, thank you for all these stimulating questions, and I give a few minutes to both speakers. Donatella, you first.
Thank you. I was continuing to think with reference to Ricardo's and to other questions about some implications of the where capitalism, where capital goes, conflicts follows, which is related with the capitalist side. So, which are the implications of the fact that the rich are also embedded in different type of cultures? Because this is part also of the type of conflicts that one expects, which implies politics, but which implies also what the capitalist will do. I was, on the one hand, reading work on Cantolas and the others on the fact that in a certain stage of the spirit of capitalism, the rich were a bit ashamed of showing off, that they felt they had to comply to some type of discourses. But at the same time, now you have the rich in the South that seems to build different type of build on different type of cultures and behaviors, in which sort of arrogance of the rich emerges in the behaviors also that we have seen in going to the moon or going on Mars without any sort of shame. So I think this is a sort of reflections that it is also important in order to assess the discursive opportunities for movements and what it implies also in terms of the strategies of capitalism. I know little about the Europeanization side, but I think that it is also important to see that this type of capitalism, which is strong also in Europe, is calling for politics that are very much oriented to no taxation and not a type of capitalism that interacts with politics on the basis of the political exchange Pizzorno was talking of, or at least a part of capitalism. So I think that's more research is needed also on that side in order to try to understand which spirit of capitalism is developing also based on this type of transformations.
Yeah, so to your comment, it is an EU project. We do have a European perspective. We do feel that by choosing different types of geographical locations and countries within the EU that are connected through certain ways in their production and labor supply system, there's a contribution there within the European space that has not been explored as such. And these paradoxical developments that you do have production being outsourced to one country, but that country sends workers to the other country, and that the European space allows for that to happen, which, looking at the global market, inhabits then a small niche, but nevertheless is very much reflective of the underlying tension within the European market between market extensions and protections within it. The global influence, I suppose, comes in with potential mobilities that are present at those yards and the connections the companies have to Vietnam, for example, and then sending Vietnamese workers to Romania. So as a backdrop, these are just the constraints and the focus of the project, and obviously I'm sort of open to connections with other projects and sort of evolutions, but yeah, we feel sort of within that space that focus is warranted, I suppose. And on the European level, what I think was one interesting development because of COVID and remote work is that some trade unions have expressed that when it came to social dialogue, there's actually been much more connections between the trade unions, and a lot of trade unions who were previously not presented in the social dialogue meeting or did not travel to Brussels before were all of a sudden present in those meetings. So, I mean, it remains to be seen in how far sort of alliances, about that sort of a breeding ground or a stepping stone for deeper or different kinds of connections. And I think, I mean, the EU, sort of what I mentioned, the response from the Commission, I mean, maybe might have been sort of, okay, it's sort of up to the national level, but also the non-acknowledgement of any type of industrial policy or interest in industrial policy or sectoral policy, but a one-size-fits-all approach, just showing the general thinking or ideological trajectory that the EU is conveying. And that was sort of in the first discussion or dialogue within the EU social dialogue the social partners had with the European Commission. So that was sort of very clear from the start. And I mean, very shortly, I think when it comes to posted work, we don't, have any clear insights to that, except from what I mentioned in terms of that. I think the inequalities have just been exacerbated and shown more, and maybe more blatantly shown in terms of that the essential work has been recognized openly and publicly and politically by opening the borders, by showing the necessity to open the borders for the survival of the industry without any acknowledgement. And we do have, I mean, the implementation of the Posting of Workers Directive, so it's something to be studied, how that will play out. But of course, from the get-go, the Posting of Workers Directive is just constitutionally separating workers from one another. So whether that will lead to total equality, we know that that's probably not going to happen from the get-go because of the directive in the first place.
Okay, thank you. It's the end of a long day. There was... Yes, of course. It's the end of a long day and a long conference. Thank you, all the speakers and all the presenters. Again, thank you to Guglielmo Meardi, who has organized all this combination, and thank and the appointment. The next meeting of the Industrial Relations in Europe Conference will be next year in Tampere, Finland, with Antti Saloniemi being the organizer and you may invite the microphone. Of course, probably the year after Tampere, we may go to Shanghai to make to follow the instruction of the discussion we had. Antti, you have the floor.
Does it work now?
Yes.
Yes. Just a short announcement that I have a pleasure to welcome you all to Tampere next September. And the date seems to be nearly exactly the same as this year. So the key message is that save the date. It is so that Tampere is not any Florence. So we can't offer that kind of sceneries and landscapes as Guillermo has done, has offered to us. But still, perhaps Tampere is a bit interesting because it is the birthplace of Finnish industrial culture and so. And the theme of the cancelled conference was something like reorientation and new directions. And well, we know that that kind of themes, they are still acute, and we continue these interesting discussions in Tampere. And one thing, I think it's clear that we'll, as well in Tampere, we hear more about and more about what's going on with this pandemic and its consequences on labor relations. So, but hope we see in Tampere. Yep. Right.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy Florence.
The sun is sunny.
At the end, warmed up, si è scaldato.